Today I'm breaking down the Weeknd's Wake Me Up featuring Justice. This track feels huge, but the arrangement is actually really simple. And today I'm going to show you how to replicate it. The space and restraint in this track is what makes the payoff so huge. So let's break it down, but first, here's the example. Okay, so we're going to jump right in, starting with the drums. We're going to have a look at the kick drum first. This is it in isolation. So a pretty basic sub kick there. Of course, this was a much longer sample, but I've shortened it, obviously, so it's not clashing with the bass. I've added some EQ here, just that I thought was necessary for this particular track. I've bumped the fundamental a little bit using dynamic EQ. And as you can see, that's around where the fundamental is hitting, perhaps maybe a little bit to the left. I've taken out some of the kind of mids here, and the reason for that is, in a lot of kick samples, they tend to, in that sort of mid-range, carry a lot of unnecessary frequencies that can sometimes sound a little bit funny within the track. And if you can just kind of bump them out, I've done so with dynamic EQ. I've taken a little bit of the top end off. This kick sample didn't really have a lot of top end in the first place, so didn't really need to do a whole heap there. And next, I've gone to Standard Clip by Sir Audio Tools, an amazing plugin if you can get it. I think it's around $10-15 maybe. And so what I'm doing here is essentially clipping the peaks. So we really want to kind of round them out. It also allows us to give it that volume without actually hard clipping the master. So this is what that sounds like without it. And then with. And as you can see, this isn't even as much as I would typically clip a kick drum, as much as I would at least in a breakbeat or sort of more of a hip hop type of track. We're only just barely, you could see a little bit of that red hitting the peaks, if that. So it was, you know, very, very minimal. And sometimes you honestly don't even really need it. But just if you want to kind of take that extra step, if you can hear a difference, if it's making a difference, then definitely. So here it is again without. And then with. So minimal, just barely rounding out those peaks. So after that, we have Smack Attack. Again, one of my favorite things about this plugin is the mix knob, and just that you can add those transients without changing the initial character of the sound. So here it is without. And then with. Again, we're going super minimal, and we just want to make sure that we're making these subtle moves and we're not sort of doing anything too drastic, especially at the beginning of a mix. So if we hear the kick drum in its raw form, we're going to turn everything off. Sounds like this. As you can hear, it's actually quite bright, and we dulled a bit of that high end. Listening to it now, maybe I probably would have worked with that initial sound a little bit more, rather than the layer I'm about to show you. But of course, the goal of this exercise is to replicate what's happening in the actual record. So this is where we got to, and with the plugins on, this is what it sounds like. So just giving it a little bit more of that push on the transient and with that little bit of clipping. So that brings me to the next track, which is actually the layer. Now this is just a kick top. Have a listen. So what we've done with a kick like this is we've actually grabbed the EQ and we've taken out all of the unnecessary frequencies that we don't need, so it doesn't clash with that initial sub kick. Now, we've taken out the lows, of course, but what we've also done here is linked it up to the initial sub kick and used dynamic EQ just to make sure that some of those top or mid frequencies also aren't clashing. And that's worked out, you know, pretty well for this, and it sort of helped it sit a lot better. So without that EQ, this is what the kick originally was. Then with. And directly after that, we added some Smack Attack, again, just to really give it that extra push. So without it, it sounds like this. Then with. And again, really subtle moves. So that's the kick, and I'm going to show you them both together. And then without the top kick. Then with. And of course, when you're blending kicks, when you're layering them, make sure nothing sounds too thin or sort of like it might be out of phase. That's really, really important to make sure that it still has that fullness and power in the mix. So moving on to the rest of the drums. Now I've got these grouped together and you'll notice that the kicks are actually sitting outside of the drum group. The reason I do that is because sometimes when the kicks are inside that group, they can feel a little bit suffocated depending on the type of processing that I do on it. So what I'll often do is separate it from the drum group so it hits the master directly and has that little bit more room to breathe. So if we have a look at just that drum group only, we've got only the snares and the hi-hats. So if we have a look at the snare, I've got that layered. So I've got 3 layers here, an 808 type clap. And that's sitting pretty wide in the mix. Then I've got the snare. And then after that, I've got a loose clap. Now this clap down the bottom is definitely more on the organic side. And the way to make this sound as cool as possible is of course to pre-shift it. And you can do that manually. So what you want to do is select it, hit command, and then the left or right arrow. And that will move it left or right just by milliseconds to ensure that you've got the right groove that works for your track. So definitely have a play around with that with your sort of pre-shifted claps. And it goes for claps that sit before and after the snare. And just make sure that it sits well and has the right groove. So without that snare, this is what it sounds like. And then with. So it makes a massive difference and definitely has that sort of classic disco type sound. So there's a cool technique for the snares that I really want to show you. This is using the EQ. What we're doing is essentially wiping out some of that low stuff that we don't really need, and we're going to bump the fundamental. Now, I'm using predominantly dynamic EQ to bump that. And here's the difference. So when it's turned off, this is what it sounds like. Now, you may think it sort of doesn't need that little boost in the fundamental, but in order to stick out in the mix when you've got a bunch of different things going on, something like this, a little technique like this can make the biggest difference. So if we have a look at that dynamic EQ when it's turned on, it's so cool. It just really thickens it that little bit more. And when you put that together with the other snares, it sounds like this. And then without that EQ, with extra bit of punch that, you know, can do wonders for your mix, and really helping that snare sit well can be a real key factor in sort of how your track comes across. So definitely look at little things like that you can do just to really lift it in the production and mix. So moving on to the percussion, the hats in this track are actually really crucial, and they're really setting up the foundation of the groove. So you could get any type of hat loop. This is pretty much what I did. The hat sounded sort of organic, and I really liked that. I think it really suited this particular track. And what you want to do, so if you have a look at the initial loop, it looks and sounds like this. Very, very basic 16ths. And when you go back to what I've done here, I've actually chopped up, shifted, and taken out some sort of unnecessary accents. And when you get those accents right, that's really what sort of defines the groove of a track. You'll sort of hear that the hat groove is not sort of where it would typically be on sort of a straight 16th loop. So if we have a listen to it in isolation just with the metronome, just so you can sort of hear where the downbeat is. As opposed to the original loop, which was this. You know, it's a little more sort of bland, a little more straightforward, and that can definitely work for a number of different genres and tracks, but this here just really needed sort of that attention to which sort of accents worked best for this particular track. So really listen for those things, because that can be the difference between a track being sort of danceable or just not really moving, or not really sort of having the type of movement that you want it to have. And what you'll notice is that I've left a gap for that open hat, because of course when a drummer is playing the hats, they're not going to sort of open the hi-hat but still have the sound of a closed hat. So you really want to, again, just try and be realistic where possible. And you'll find your tracks actually sound better when that's the case. So that open hi-hat sounds like this. I pretty much use this same one for most things. That's one by Cashmere, works really well. You'll also notice that that open hi-hat is actually quite short. Now, the The reason for that is that, again, I was just really listening closely to the groove of the track and really playing around with that command right, left arrow just to make sure that the groove was perfect. And it just takes that experimentation, shortening things, lengthening things, all of that stuff just to really make sure that you've got it sort of down pat. And that's whether it's with your track or, if you're replicating someone else's as an exercise. So that's more or less all of the drums. So I'll show you the processing that I did on the bus. And again, very early on in the track, I moved the kick out of that bus. So, this is sort of processing that was done regardless. You can try it yourself. Maybe your kick will sort of fit a little bit better, or maybe you can sort of maneuver, certain EQs and things like that to make it work. But this is what I had here. So tiny bit of EQ, taking off some of that high end. That's often sort of underestimated, especially with hats and things like that. They can get very, very bright, and just sort of shifting that high end can really give you even more of a sort of vintage feel, which is what I was sort of going for with this track. If it's too bright, too clean, it doesn't have that sort of retro feel to it. Then T-Rex Classic Clipper, I'm soft clipping the drums here, just as I was the kick, just using a different clipper here. This is another one that I really like, and it's really nice. You can get more of a sort of round tone with this one if you use the slope correctly. So just sort of turning that to the left can really give you a rounder tone rather than something with a little more attack, which sort of standard clip naturally has. So of course we've backed off some of the volume to make sure we're not peaking there. And that's more or less it. I'd played around with obviously some compression, drum bus, limiting. I don't know why that's on there actually. Wouldn't typically limit drums, but really, really simple. Just keeping it sort of very minimal in terms of processing. The only other thing that I really did was parallel compress individual elements. So, typically I'd do this on the actual bus, but I seem to have done it for sort of each instrument here. And really doing that just helps those things pop through the mix. So if we have a look at the sends here, you can go ahead and copy these settings for my compressor here, really just sort of smashing the ratio, taking the attack down, taking the release down, the thresholds all the way down. And one thing that you want to really make sure you do is actually solo it and level match, because if it's too loud, you're essentially just adding volume, and that's not really going to do your track any favors. It's just going to add more and more volume. So what you want it to do is add a sort of energy and add that real sort of compressed sound. Aim for around sort of minus 24 dB of gain reduction just to really get that sort of squash sound, and you want to blend that in with the original signal. It's an amazing technique. Be careful not to overdo it. It's very easy to do that, but using this where necessary can make all the difference for your tracks. So just in solo there, this is what it sounds like. Then without. So as you can see, I actually forgot to gain match this one. So again, don't recommend that. I probably could have had it sounding slightly nicer if I didn't do that. But yeah, that would just be a matter of taking this down and matching it until it sounds right without the actual compressor. And you can do that for all of your instruments. Okay, so moving on to the bass, I'm going to show you in solo with the drums. This is what it sounds like. So the first type of bass that I went to was actually an 808. So I figured that this sort of suited, the general sort of sound of the Weeknd, although they're probably using a lot more of the vintage machines and things like that. But I just felt that this kind of supported the bass in the right way, really just lifted it and sort of gave it a little bit more of a foundation in the low end. So this is what that first bass sounds like. And of course, that clipping can just be fixed by, adjusting the attack or something on Serum. So starting with some very basic EQ, rolling off some of that low end and just a bit of that high end that we don't really need. And then of course, we're using some dynamic EQ. Again, just a really great technique for this sort of thing. And what we're doing is blocking out the fundamental of the kick that's likely to clash with the bass. So that's again, hooked up to kick one, our main sub, and just making sure that the fundamental of that kick, which you saw that we boosted earlier, is being pulled directly from our bass with that dynamic EQ. So if you have a look at it in action here, this is what it looks like. So you can see the red, that's where our kick is. And you can see that that would 100% likely clash with the bass. You could probably even do a little more around these peaks where you can see those clashes very, very noticeably. And directly after that, it looks like I may have tried a little bit of saturation, probably didn't need it, which is good, less the better. So the next track underneath that is more of an 80s bass, and it sounds like this. So I'm using Serum for this preset, but I've had similar sounds in plugins like Juno 106 and more of those kind of 80s leaning synths like Moogs and things like that. Of course, I don't use any outboard, but just sort of in terms of different plugins you can use for that. But if we have a look at the EQ, I've left it pretty natural. I didn't feel the need to sort of wipe all of the low end out. It was sitting okay, and the preset naturally sits more towards the mids, especially due to the key we're in. So I sort of took out some of those lows. I probably could have taken out a little bit more up to around here maybe, just to keep that middle range in there. But I really didn't sort of see the need just to sort of wipe things for the sake of it. It was sort of sounding all right, wasn't clashing. Of course, with a lot of this dynamic EQ stuff that I do to pull out those frequencies and make sure they don't clash with things like the kick, you can sort of worry less about it sort of clashing and doing things like that and not sitting right in the mix. So directly after that, I'm putting some standard clip. It doesn't seem to be doing much. I seem to have given it a little bit of volume. Probably don't do that for absolutely no reason. There's no reason to put on a plugin if you're not sort of using it. I must have just chucked it on and then forgotten about it. So we'll leave that there, but of course you could soft clip it if you wanted to. Bit of limiting. So I'm getting around that sort of -4 of gain reduction. You don't have to limit things like this, but I just find that it kind of levels out those peaks and just softens the transients a little bit. That's really the main reason I did it. I didn't sort of fear that it would peak or anything like that, just sort of made it sit that little bit better for me. And again, I've done the exact same thing. I've just sort of monoed that lower end, a lot of that sort of 500 and below. And so together, those basses sound like this. And then if we have a look at the group, we've got Kickstart 2, which is hooked up to our main kick. And that's just ducking some of the volume from the transient of that kick. You don't always need to do this, but I just find that it sort of takes it to that next level in terms of how clean it sort of comes across. So if you have a look at the bands, I've sort of let 1K and upwards go here. Like I haven't just sort of ducked the whole thing. And it just lets some of that distortion from the high end of the 80s synth really pop through. So if we have a look here, this is what it sounds like. And you'll see the curve is only set right up to the sort of main bulk of that kick. Got it set to a quarter, so it's a little quicker. It's not sort of dipping very hard and letting it go slowly. So it's working pretty well there. And then lastly, I've got parallel compression on the bass. And as you can see, just blending it in a little bit. So again, the bass and drums together. So next up, we're going to look at the synths and guitars. So what I'm going to do first is isolate the synth that I used. And right here, I'm using the Juno 106, and that's actually a Roland VST. So here it is. So pretty cool sound. It's definitely got that vintage feel to it. What I did was basically go to a preset 1984 synth. Again, a lot of the Weeknd stuff is very 1980s inspired, sort of that Michael Jackson and a bunch of other artists from that kind of era, and basically just adjusted it, looked at the envelope, frequency, just to get a little bit of that fuzz in the track, not have it too kind of muted or mellow. And this particular preset worked really nicely. I've got the chorus set to 2, which is a bit of a signature sound of this Juno, and sort of gives it that width. So without it, it sounds like this. It's almost a completely different sound. And then you add this chorus button. It's really cool. It just gives you that sort of maximum width, which I really love about this synth in general. If you can get your hands on a VST like this, I definitely would. There's a lot to learn sort of about sound design and things like that, just playing around with the knobs on the actual synth. So definitely give this one a go. And if not this one, there are definitely cheaper alternatives. There are free versions of this, so definitely check that out. And to treat this, I've essentially taken out some of the lows that I didn't really need, because obviously I wanted to leave that space for the synth bass and the 808. Seem to have another EQ here, and we've hooked this up to the snare. This was actually getting me for a while. I was wondering why on earth the sort of drums just weren't sitting. There was something completely wrong, and I couldn't figure out why it just sort of wasn't hitting the way my tracks usually do. And I found out that within this Juno, there's actually frequencies clashing directly with the snare. So what I did was I hooked it up to my snare, just to the main sort of bigger snare, and just pulled out some of the fundamental from the synth. And that just helped it sit so much better. So this is what it's doing, just so you can have a look. The red is the snare. And sometimes a lot of mix issues can be as simple as that. Just really diving in and pulling out some of that stuff with something like dynamic EQ, just to help it sit better in the mix. Next up, we've got Kickstart 2. Again, this just gives it that extra bit of cleanliness. We're really ducking some of the volume this time. So that's just, again, linked directly to the kick. I've given it a little bit of compression. It's a fairly dynamic synth, which I really like, but this just really ironed out some of those peaks and just helped it sit a little bit better. I didn't end up using multiband, which is probably good. And then what I've done here is actually automate the silencers with utility. I do this all the time, and it just makes room for the snare. So what we're essentially doing is hitting that and then ducking whenever the synth isn't hitting. So we don't have any of that sort of runoff or sort of release time that's in the synth. And you could do that with the actual sound and just turn the release down just so it's dead whenever it's not playing. But then you won't get the same feeling, or you won't get the same sort of lush sound that you would with that release time up. So here's with. And then without. Now, of course, you'll still hear some of the delays, but that was intentional. I wanted some sort of, ping pong delay sort of playing around the stereo field. That's totally fine. But what we're missing is this. So if I turn it off, have a listen to the sort of ringing of the synth after it plays. And so that just does a great job of really cleaning that up. Next up, I've widened it slightly more just with Ozone 9. Added a little bit of reverb, just a touch. The mix isn't very high here, nor is the decay, just 1 second. It just gives it that extra bit of lushness, that extra bit of width and sort of depth. But be careful not to overdo it with something like reverb, because it can definitely destroy the sound and really make it unidentifiable from the original. Right after that, because we've got that dead space there, there's a perfect opportunity, if it's the sound that you're going for, if it's something that you want to fill it out, to use a little bit of delay. So without it, this is what it sounds like. And then with. And so that's the synth. Right after that, we move to the guitars. So the first thing you should be aware of is that I did this all with VST guitars. You don't always need to actually play stuff in to sort of get the sound that you're after. And I'm saying that as a guitarist myself. So what I used here was Electric Sunburst. I've printed it, but I'm going to show you exactly how I did it. But if we have a look at just the guitars in isolation first. So that's all sampled guitars from Contact 8 with Electric Sunburst. So the very first thing that I used was the reggae preset. And basically all I got from that was I played in just the note that was being used in the track. Again, it's not identical, but it's pretty similar. And what we're looking for are the principles here. The principles of the arrangement, how things are set up, what sort of colors, tones, and instruments are used. So here's the sample that I used. I'll just put the piano on here. So simply playing that in, I was then able to print it and then shift it as needed. So I've got all these notes to play with. It sounds natural because it's from a sort of sampled library like Contact. And what I did with one of those notes, I actually had to lengthen it because, of course, it's not going to have the same feel if everything's just completely chopped and at that length. So what I did with that last note, this one here, this is basically a duplicate of this note to the left of it. And all I did was double click. I hit the ×2 on the right here. And what that'll show you is typically the note expanding or contracting. And if you change the warp setting to Pro, it'll be as if someone played it in at that length. So it's a very useful tool and definitely, is believable when you're kind of time stretching and stuff, at least in Ableton. That works amazingly. So not much processing going on there. I've used probably one of my favorite plugins, CLA-FX. Just use the top, bit of drive, bit of room. So without it, this is what it sounds like. With. It's got some really nice chorus, bit of slapback, And it's honestly one of my most used plugins, so definitely recommend that one. Right after that, of course, I've got Soothe, just to, as the preset suggests, de-spike that guitar and just take away some of those resonances around that 2 to 4K. Directly after that, we've got a much pluckier guitar, but a little more sort of muted out and in the background of the track. So it sounds like this. I think in the actual track, it might even be slightly more muted out, more of a high pass on that track. But this is, again, same principles I used with Electric Sunburst. I just played in a preset, printed it out, and did what I had to with the processing. So a bit of satin just to give it a little bit of drive. Again, another favorite of mine. Touch of compression just to really even it out. Use CLA effects just for some room reverb and for some chorus. And use Pro Q3 just to make sure I was staying out of the way of the fundamentals of the other guitar. So next we have the effects, and in this section, keeping things really, really simple, just got a very basic uplifter that sounds like this. Nothing too fancy there, not really processing it much. A lot of those sort of samples just come with the right processing on them. And then what I've done is essentially reverse that uplifter. And on this one, we've added just a little bit of kickstart too. And as you can see, the mix is around 74%. So we don't want to duck it in volume completely. We still want it to sort of have that lush kind of sound when it drops in. And so as far as the instrument group processing, we've pretty much just got some kickstart too. Again, leaving out some of those higher frequencies and just allowing it to sit with sort of minimal sidechaining, nothing too drastic. You've got to be careful when you start getting into those really sort of deep sidechain dips. That's when it sort of becomes almost a different genre and can sometimes even sound a little bit dated if you're sort of not in the right genre for that. So definitely be cautious of that. We're using sidechaining, using dynamic EQ, really just to clean up the relationship between different instruments rather than sort of dipping that volume stylistically. So having a look at some of the mastering plugins, we've got an EQ first up, a little bit of that low end out, just up to around 18, bumping some of that fundamental and of course some mid-side, taking away the lows from the sides of the mixes, which does a lot for your master. Especially if you're using something like 808s, it really just cleans them up and allows them to sort of hit straight down the middle and makes a massive difference. Taken out around some of that 300 and didn't do much with the sort of top end because I found it to be a bit bright, so didn't end up using that. Again, touch of compression. This is all stock standard stuff I do on just about every mix, but of course tailoring it to the track that you actually have. A ratio of just over 2, pushing the threshold pretty far back just to get that nice sort of compressed and even sort of sound for a pop track. And you can see I haven't particularly overdone it with the attack, maybe more of a hip hop type track where transients are really, really important. I'm probably pushing that a little bit more forward, but in this case, it didn't really need it. And just the release, we want a bit of that pumping kind of energy. At least I do in tracks. Like I usually prefer that sort of sound. And we've got about minus 4.5 dB of gain reduction. And that's debatable whether or not that's too much. Some people will say 2 to 3. It's really up to you and what sort of feels good for your track. I usually like that little bit extra just because I can get a little bit more of that energy out of the track, which is just more of a stylistic thing for me. But minus 4.5 shouldn't be too bad in a lot of situations like this. We're using a little bit of standard clip here, so have a look at what it's doing to the transients. Really barely touching those transients, a little bit more than what we looked at previously, but you really don't want to overdo it here because you could potentially ruin the sort of sound of your track, and you really want to sort of maintain it, but just elevate it with those sort of rounded peaks, which is exactly what soft clipping does. Moving on to Soothe, again, probably one of my go-to presets on Soothe, Master by Goodwin 2, rounds out that low end, suppresses a lot of those frequencies around that sort of 150 to 200 mark, and then a little bit in the top end, not doing a whole heap here. Again, a really good way to ruin your mixes if you overdo it with something like Soothe, so definitely use it as a finishing touch and sort of don't drive that depth too much. After that, a little bit of width, just with Ozone 9, widening the mid-range a little bit here. I would typically sort of lower that low end, not sure why I didn't, but yeah, I would typically drop that a little bit just to kind of get those lows hitting right through the middle. You'll see this sort of wavering around a little bit. That's because of the Juno. On the real Juno hardware, you'll find that a lot of that chorus sort of stays sort of swishing around, and it does it on the plugin as well. You just got to turn the tone back, so I would definitely do that. And then I used the Master Assistant just to clean up the EQ if necessary. It gives me a bit of dynamic EQ. So I love doing that with Ozone, can be really useful. As you can see, mix looked all right, so it only just took out a touch of that low end. And then, of course, my go-to mastering plugin, getting around -3 dB of gain reduction, adding a little bit of focus, which is sort of high mids, just sort of gave it that extra bit of lift, touch of air, touch of transients, a little more of that transient attack, analog compression, which is really nice on this plugin too. Just gives you that finishing touch, just ironing out some of those peaks a little more. A bit of bass punch, which is really nice too, gives you some of that low end, and obviously some volume just to get it up to a decent volume. I think we hit... So we're hitting around -10 for this track. It's a pretty good goal. I think in general, I'll sometimes go for -9, especially if I'm handing in a demo to say a label or something like that. But around sort of that -10 integrated LUFS is usually pretty good. And of course, I've got referencing the track itself. And Sonar works for my Sennheiser HD 650s when I'm working on headphones, which just really sort of flattens that frequency response and makes it easier to sort of check things and tweak things on headphones. So in its entirety, here's the full mix. If you enjoyed this breakdown, check out this video next. It has a bunch more production tips and tricks you can use right away. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more production videos like this.